Good evening once again, everyone. Hell's Unicorn here, reporting to you live from the hot as hell marshes of eastern Pennsylvania. And just so all of you know, when I say hot as hell marshes, I'm actually being serious. The locale which I currently reside at is actually a good part of it is actually federally protected wetland. The town that I live in was actually built on top of a giant swamp, and so whenever it goes above 90 degrees, it gets really humid, and it is very difficult to be outside for more than a half hour at a time. Even though I'm a good old fashioned hick farmer boy with animals and crops to attend to, although to be perfectly honest, most of my crops are just your standard garden fare. I don't have anything substantial like corn in the fields or anything like that. The only thing that we get that gets harvested from our property is hay, and we don't use all of it, so we just give it to one of the local farmers, and he decides what to do with it, and he pays a small fee for collecting it. But anyway, I have just encountered another doozy from Truthout.org. And for those of you that are not familiar with this site, this is one of the most ridiculous yet somehow highly respected New Left news outlets here on the internet. And I've just encountered a relatively new article. Actually, I came across it last night. It was actually published day before yesterday. That's June 7th on Tuesday. And it is actually a ad plugging a book under the guise of an article. Now, the individual in question who wrote this article, his name is Ha-Jun Chang. He's a South Korean national, and he is supposedly a well-respected person in academia over there, and he obviously has some kind of a liaison with the American left. And the title of this book is called 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And this article contains the first of these 23 things. Now, this book, based on the suggested format, looks like an idiot's guide to socialism. But in truth, what it is it's a series of brief and utterly witless attempts to try to debunk the concept of a free market. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through this, and I'm going to pause at a few instances to clear up some obvious misconceptions, straw man arguments, and a bunch of other things that this thing is loaded with. Just suffice to say, to preface all of this, I'm surprised that this guy is actually a professor at some kind of university, because I only have a bachelor degree and it's not in economics, and this is really this is something a third grader could probably debunk. It's so bad. That's a little bit hyperbolic, but anyway. So, the first section of 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism is titled, There Is No Such Thing as a Free Market. And the argument goes as such. First they do is they give you a presupposition, which is titled, What They Tell You. What is they, I wonder? They as in neocon Republicans that support the same big government stuff that these guys do, moderate conservatives that just want to trim a little fat around the edges, or psychotic fringe libertarians like myself that want to tear down a good bit of the useless crap that these guys have put up over the past 100 years. But anyway, I digress. Section 1. What they tell you. Markets need to be free. When the government interferes to dictate what market participants can or cannot do, resources cannot flow to their most efficient use. If people cannot do the things that they find most profitable, they lose the incentive to invest and innovate. Thus, if the government puts a cap on house rents, landlords lose the incentive to maintain their properties or build new ones. No, I'm just going to stop right there. This entire presupposition is really misleading, because it just has the typical blinders on it that you tend to get with so-called progressives. They assume that competition doesn't exist unless the government is there to play the competitor's role and to restrict abuses of consumers. But anyway, continuing on. Or if the government restricts the kinds of financial products that can be sold to contracting parties that may both have benefited from innovative transactions that fool their idiosyncratic needs, cannot reap the potential gains of free contract. People must be left free to choose, as the title of free market visionary Milton Friedman's famous book goes. Okay, so based on this presupposition that's put before us, which is extremely vague and general, and puts out a couple of real juicy images of, diabolical industrialists with fat bellies and a fatter cigar in their mouth, kicking people out of their rent-controlled homes. I mean, that's beautiful. Let's look at it this way. Rent control right now. One of the reasons why rent has gone as high as it has is because of barriers to entry. And these barriers to entry consist of a number of different things. There are automatic incentives for people to improve their properties in order to attract more business. But that incentive only exists insofar as there is competition to procure it. When you put up barriers to entry, you have less competition, ergo there's less incentive to maintain good conditions. Thus, the self-fulfilling prophecy commences. The government creates the problem and then comes in to solve it, ergo by giving price controls and enforcing these really ridiculous regulations on safety, which usually reach far beyond what they need to be. I am not a person who believes that people should carelessly build their houses and have structures collapse and people die without any action allowed to be taken. But this presupposition also assumes things such as there being no court system available for redress of grievances, which is preposterous. Name for me one single free market proponent, be it somebody who's either minarchistic or anarchistic, who argues that you should have no ability for redress of grievances if you get shafted on a deal. The problem with overactive legislatures, which is already, I can smell the advocacy for laws to be piled up upon other existing laws in a very redundant fashion. And essentially what you get here is you get, a system where you have so many laws that there's no actual way to follow them all, and you'll also get laxity of enforcement because there's no way to enforce them all. But again, I digress here. The overall point is that a lot of times expectation will feed into an outcome. And when people expect people to be lying scumbags and are treated that way even before they've had the opportunity to engage in actual economic activity, that generally tends to be how they behave. Only because of the regulating body, instead of simply trying to shortcut these so-called safety standards and get themselves into trouble, they'll be sure to bribe the enforcing officers before they do it. And believe me when I tell you, most people, except for real true believers who are very hard to find, they have a price. And they will be bought off. I mean, the whole purpose of lobbyists, long story short, is to procure exemptions from a lot of these laws. And these restrictions that are put in place, these so-called regulations, encourage lobbyists because, in essence, government functions as a business, so why not buy a few shares in it? But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent here. Now, what they don't tell you, this is where the blinders really come on and you really don't see the big picture. The free market doesn't exist. Every market has some rules and boundaries that restrict freedom of choice. All right, stop right there. Oh, I get so tired of hearing this argument. This isn't a straw man. This is a gigantic pagan wicker man totem that is being set on fire in order to bring in the harvest of modern-day progressive socialism. That's the magnitude of this fallacy. There has never been, to my recollection, and I have read tons of people tied in with free market theory. Some, they have differing viewpoints as to implementation. Some are anarcho-capitalists, some are minarchists, some are, slightly larger minarchists than others, and so on and so forth. But nobody ever suggests that there shouldn't be rules. What they are suggesting is that the power of the enforcer be limited and that the rules in question be reasonable and practical. You see, that's the thing that this article or this section of this book doesn't get into. What constitutes a reasonable and practical regulation? From my standpoint, it's very simple. Contract enforcement. Every transaction has some kind of a contract and a receipt. And we have a court system so that we can seek grievances if there be some kind of a breach of contract or some kind of inherent fraud. So, in essence, the function of the courts is paramount in this regard. Now, the legislature functions largely in order to correct any more broader problems with the laws as they exist. The legislature is necessary insofar as we have constant redress of grievances because of existing abuses, and then in the interest of efficiency you need to clamp down on these, but these are usually common sense things. There's no law that's going to prevent people from committing fraud. The only thing you can do is punish them after the fact. And the truth of the matter is fraud is not as widespread as people would like to think, and more times than not fraud is usually dealt with in a highly inconsistent fashion depending on who's bought whatever favors from whatever officials in government. Continuing on. Our market looks free only because we so unconditionally accept its underlying restrictions that we fail to see them. All right, stop right here. The problem with the basic premise of this article is that this person has an assumption about freedom that divorces the law of cause and effect from the occasion. This person is assuming that without government, there is no effect to rein in a given cause. They assume that people will get away with everything if the state is not there to stop them before the fact and to treat them like a criminal before they've actually committed the crime. That's the thinking that's on display here. But of course it's painted with a lot of nice big words so that it sounds intellectual. But so far I haven't read anything intellectual. In fact, I've read a lot of anti-intellectual points already made in the first two paragraphs. Continuing. How free a market is cannot be objectively defined. Hold it right there. Okay. Let's go over the basic definition of what objective is. Objective is something that is universally accepted based on its observability. An object, for instance, I'm holding a cup of iced tea in my hand and I'm about to take a sip of it. Now, you didn't see that, but if I had my video camera working, which currently I don't, you could have seen that with your own eyes and you could deduce that that was what I actually did. Within the context of market economics, there are things that can be observed, there are things that can be cataloged, there are statistics that can be analyzed and disseminated and so on and so forth. And from that, you can come to a reasonable conclusion with regards to trends. Likewise, there are things that can easily be gleaned through observable empirical data. From this, we draw objective viewpoints regarding certain values within the marketplace. Now, there is a level of subjectivity insofar as what people decide to do with their respective talents, and in likewise fashion, there is subjectivity into the proper value of a given good or service. But the objective truth is that these specific goods and services are regulated by things that are not necessarily visible, but they are things that can be disseminated and they can be understood. The notion that the market cannot be objectively defined is about the same as saying we can't objectively define what genocide is because we can't determine what the actual numbers are that constitute a genocide, whether 500,000 people dead or 2 million people dead, which is utterly absurd. We have a definition of terms that we can refer to in the dictionary which gives us a very clear and objective picture of what that meaning is. And to argue that because there are differing opinions with regards to the levels of freedom versus the levels of regulation is a fallacious argument to state that there's no such thing as a free market. The concept of the free market does exist relative to the level of controls. But the notion of what they refer to, this is a utopian straw man. This is something that nobody ever advocates. The notion that if we got rid of all regulations, that things would suddenly work perfectly and that people would stop stealing from each other and all of that. Nobody ever argues it, at least nobody that I know or speak to, or anybody who's actually seriously involved in free market economics. What is argued is that the freer a market is, the more productive and the more equitable it tends to be. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing in this entire article that suggests the opposite is true. In fact, they defeated their own argument by saying that the free market cannot be objectively defined, because if you can't objectively define freedom, how are you going to objectively define slavery or coercion? But anyway, continuing on with this barrel of nonsense. The usual claim by free market economists that they are trying to defend the market from politically motivated interference by the government is false. Government is always involved, and those free marketers are as politically motivated as anyone. Overcoming the myth that there is such a thing as an objectively defined free market is the first step towards understanding capitalism. Okay, stop right there. Political involvement pertains specifically to government. Now, as I stated earlier, government involvement in unnecessary regulation leads to lobbyists in Washington, and it leads to barriers to entry, which I stated previously. These are objectively observable and definable concepts, and they pertain to the struggle between free markets and authoritarian markets. So this whole notion that you can't objectively define a free market is ridiculous. And it rests on this premise that freedom is this sort of utopian existence where cause and effect don't coexist with each other, that you can do anything and that there's no consequence whatever to what you do, and that there isn't a reaction to whatever action that you commit. Anyway, continuing on. Labor ought to be free. Now this is the juiciest part of the article, and this is the one that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. In 1819, new legislation to regulate child labor, the Cotton Factories Regulation Act, was tabled in the British Parliament. The proposed regulation was incredibly light touch by modern standards. It would ban the employment of young children, that is, those under the age of 9. Older children between 10 and 16 would be allowed to work, but with their working hours restricted to 12 per day. Yes, they were really going soft on those kids. The new rules applied only to cotton factories, which were recognized to be exceptionally hazardous to workers' health. The proposal caused huge controversy. Opponents saw it as undermining the sanctity of freedom of contract and thus destroying the very foundation of the free market. In debating this legislation, some members of the House of Lords objected to it on the grounds that labor ought to be free. Their argument said the children want and need to work and the factory owners want to employ them. What is the problem? I've got an even better argument for you. If these conditions in these cotton factories were as hazardous as they are making out to be, which they could well have been, I'm not necessarily an expert in the safety measures that are taken in early 19th century cotton factories, where is the judgment of the parents of these children? This gets into a certain area that I'm only going to touch upon briefly. Are parents so incompetent that they can't make decisions as to whether or not their children should be employed by a certain employer because safety measures might not be where they need to be? And furthermore, let me ask another question. The reason why these children were probably working was there was probably a necessity because the families were poor, and it's possible that one or more of the parents may have been injured on the job, and thus the children were needed to work in order to support the whole family. Were there any proposals put along with this act to make sure that when these children were prohibited from working, that their families got taken care of? I am willing to guess probably not. Now, there were private institutions that probably could have taken care of them if that had been the case. The church was still somewhat of a factor in England back in this point, although now it's just a complete joke. It's just a propaganda arm of British Parliament, basically. But there was a time when the Anglican Church was involved in worthwhile endeavors, and in America, some of the various synods of the American Anglican or the Episcopalian Church are still involved in charitable work. But this kind of gets to my fundamental point regarding the blinders that this author has basically put on. No talk whatsoever about whether or not these families needed this labor. There was no inquiry as to whether or not the parents were of a particular judgment to actually decide whether or not their children should be working in these plants. And there's not really an objective standard to determine exactly how risky these particular places were. There was a section in here that makes a subjective, which were recognized to be exceptionally hazard to workers' health. Now, there's no specific standard cited, but I'm assuming it's because of the inhaling of cotton dander in the air, which over time can cause breathing problems. But that's the only thing that I can think of offhand. But again, this isn't even touched upon. So the intended effect of scaring people into saying, "Oh no, children shouldn't work," is entirely ineffective here. But reading on. Today, even the most ardent free market proponents in Britain and other rich countries would not think of bringing child labor back as part of the market liberalization package that they so want. However, until the late 19th or the early 20th century, when the first serious child labor regulations were introduced in Europe and North America, many respectable people judged child labor to be against the principles of a free market. All right. Now, we've basically been presented with a scary, albeit vague, scenario of children working in sweatshops, their healths being compromised, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that whether or not these child labor laws were actually effectual, which I actually have a link in the description which argues that they were not, at this point in time, if you decide that you wish to pay a 11 or 12-year-old kid to fix your computer, you could be subject to fines and even jail time. I don't know what risk factors are involved with curing a computer virus, but there's a lot of pre-teenagers and maybe even children as young as 10 years old who can actually handle this stuff. But they are prohibited in doing this for money. They have to do it to me as a favor in order for it to be legal. Or else it's considered child labor. At the very least, I would argue that our child labor laws should be updated to account for the fact that not all work constitutes a sweatshop. But the minute that you even bring up the possibility, something, it might be good for my kid to maybe get out of this failing public school system and go into an apprenticeship somewhere, or maybe get some vocational training, they'll be like, "Oh, no, child labor, no!" They go hysterical over it. It's not a political issue to them. It's a moral issue. Ergo, it's a pseudo-religious argument. You can't go against it or else you're a terrible human being. And that's the overall drive of this article. Yeah, although in this article, in addition to being monsters that want to kick poor people out of their houses and put children to work in sweatshops, we're also psychopathical people that can't deal with reality because our beliefs don't actually exist in a reality, according to this article. Of course, no actual factual argument is given, just an appeal to subjectivity that's very weak. Anyway, going on. Thus seen, the freedom of the market is, like beauty, in the eyes of the beholder. If you believe that the right of children not to have to work is more important than the right of factory owners to be able to hire whoever they find most profitable, you will not see a ban on child labor as an infringement on the freedom of the labor market. Again, they're putting out the sweatshop straw man. I want to pay, my neighbor's kid to fix my computer. Just hypothetically speaking, in most cases I can do it myself. But anyway, that's against the law currently. So child labor is an extremely vague standard. I mean, it could be anything from paying your kid to sweep up the floor or to do some household chores, or it could be, something like maybe even sending them to an apprenticeship to maybe do some car repair work, which may be a little bit more risky, but given that proper safety standards are observed, not terribly risky. But again, that's also probably against the law. You see, the beauty of child labor laws is that in many cases, you can actually get kids to work and not pay them. Let me ask you what's worse. Having the neighborhood kid come over and learn how to fix your car as something that's of value to his own education, but then telling him you're not going to pay him for it even though he actually provided you with a service, or going against the archaic child labor laws and giving the kid $100 for tuning up your engine. It's against the law, but I don't see a problem with it, and I don't see why anyone else would. I mean, if the kid gets injured in the process, that's another thing, but we're assuming that that's going to happen. Anyway, continuing on. We don't have to go back 2 centuries to see regulations we take for granted and accept as the ambient noise within the free market that were seriously challenged as undermining the free market when first introduced. When environmental regulations, e.g. regulations on car and factory emissions, appeared a few decades ago, they were opposed by many as serious infringements on our freedom to choose. Their opponents asked, if people want to drive in more polluting cars, or if factories find more polluting production methods more profitable, why should the government prevent them from making such choices? Today, most people accept these regulations as natural. I don't, but continuing on. They believe the actions that harm others, however unintentionally, such as pollution, need to be restricted. I do too, but not through legislation. But anyway, continuing on. They also understand that it is sensible to make careful use of our energy resources when many of them are non-renewable. And they may believe that reducing human impact on climate makes sense too. Again, we're given a doomsday scenario. We're assuming that, you support the free market, you're in favor of pollution because you don't like preemptive regulations on pollution. A lot of the problems with pollution can be cured more easily by simply educating people better on the downside to pollution. The long-term health and sustainability of the environment is in the best interests of everybody, particularly people involved in a profession such as mine, agriculture. I have an incentive to make sure that my soil is renewed through proper and natural fertilization processes so that I can reap a good harvest next year and that I have plenty of good, wholesome feed for the animals that I have here, aka my horses. I also have dogs, but I have to buy dog food for them, so that's not the same thing. I'm dependent on somebody else outside of my property for that particular resource to maintain the infrastructure of my business. But just think about this for a second. If a person understands that a car, A, runs more efficiently, B, has less of an impact on the air we breathe, which we need, it logically follows that through good advertising, you can sell people on this technology. This article assumes that everybody wants to pollute and that in order to prevent this, we need to force producers to put out cars that won't pollute as bad. And honestly, name one person, even on YouTube here, that thinks this way and isn't a troll. And I'll be surprised. Anyway, continuing on. If the same market can be perceived to have varying degrees of freedom by different people, there is really no objective way to determine how free that market is. So in other words, because we have degrees of measurement, we can't objectively define what is free and what is not. The whole premise here is ridiculous. All right, continuing. In other words, the free market is an illusion. If some markets look free, it is only because we so totally accept the regulations that are propping them up that they become visible. I have news for you. Most of these regulations are not propping up the market. The reason why there's things such as the Ron Paul revolution and the somewhat half-hearted Tea Party movement of 2009 is because people understand that these regulations are not propping up the market. They're tearing it down. And the more redundant and ridiculous laws that we pass, the harder it is to function without bribing certain politicians. Not everybody else has capital laid aside in order to bribe these politicians, so we're forced out of business, and we all go and work for another company that's already established. I mean, and people wonder why Walmart is basically taking over the entire market. It's because nobody can afford to compete with them, because not only has Walmart gotten the market cornered, but nobody can afford all of the barriers to entry in order to get into the retail business or into the general grocery store and supermarket business, which Walmart is now starting to encroach into, so to speak. And then finally, the last section of this colossal gem of utter ignorance. Piano wires and kung fu masters. Like many people as a child, I was fascinated by all those gravity-defying kung fu masters in Hong Kong movies. Like many kids, conditions of trade are specified too. One of the things that surprised me when I first moved to Britain in the mid-1980s was that one could demand a full refund for a product one didn't like, even if it wasn't faulty. At the time, you just couldn't do that in Korea, except in the most exclusive department stores. In Britain, the consumer's right to change her mind was considered more important than the right of the seller to avoid the costs involved in returning unwanted yet functional products to the manufacturer. There are many other rules regulating various aspects of the exchange process: product liability, failure in delivery, loan default, and so on. In many countries, there are also necessary permissions for the location of sales outlets, such as restrictions on street vending or zoning laws that ban commercial activities in residential areas. I love this. Zoning laws. Basically the product of the Roman Catholic Church and also of fascism. I understand why corporatist Roman Catholics love zoning laws, but I have no idea why atheists love this stuff, because this whole thing is born of a tyrannical view of Christianity that even, a backward Christian like myself who identifies as Catholic doesn't accept. So, I don't know what your excuse is. But anyway, all of this assumes that a free market does not allow for contract enforcement via the court system and an executive system in order to carry out the rulings of the courts via policing actions. Long story short, if a business has an existing contract with its or existing standards that are advertised to their customers saying that we will take a return simply because you don't like a product, people will buy from that particular business. There is nothing about Britain's ridiculous laws saying that the consumer is always right, no matter what they think, no matter how unreasonable their objections are, that has anything to do with the notion of these things coming about in the marketplace. The government is always behind the curve on a lot of this stuff. And again, with child labor, if you read The Trouble with Child Labor Laws, which is linked to in the description, you'll see that in many cases the government passes these laws long after it's no longer a problem, usually because most people already agree with it, so they don't care. Now, later on down the line, this short-sighted way of doing things causes problems, like the example I laid out with my 11 or 12-year-old tech support person who I would like to hire in order to fix my computer. But again, I digress. Continuing on. Then there are private price regulations. I'm not talking here just about those highly visible phenomena such as rent controls or minimum wages that free market economists love to hate. Wages in rich countries are determined more by immigration control than anything else, including any minimum wage legislation. How is the immigration maximum determined? Not by the free labor market, which, if left alone, will end up replacing 80 to 90% of native workers with cheaper and more productive immigrants. Again, right here assuming that native workers will not learn to live within their means and accept lower prices and lower pay. And also it assumes that with this, with the increase in productivity due to a leveling out of the nature of business profits in regards to employee wages, that this money will not be able to buy the same, if not more, things in the future. Currently, with our ridiculous fiat currency system, a dollar today can't buy what 10 cents did 50 or 60 years ago. Continuing on. Following the 2008 financial crisis, the prices of loans, if you can get one or if you already have a variable rate loan, have become a lot lower in many countries thanks to the continuous slashing of interest rates. Was that because suddenly people didn't want loans and the banks needed to lower their prices to shift them? No, it was the result of political decisions to boost demand by cutting interest rates, which led to the current economic crisis that we're now in. You want an example of how this works? This mode of thinking works. Take a look at Greece, take a look at Iceland, and other countries that have had banks collapse under the weight of currency degradation. I'm going to stop here with this article because, quite frankly, it's such an insult to my intelligence that I can't bear to get through it. But there's one other argument down at the bottom where this article actually uses George W. Bush as an example of why TARP was a good idea. Senator Jim Bunning was one of TARP's leading opponents, and this article basically tries to rip him a new one and uses George W. Bush as a model. Let me ask all of you so-called progressives a question. You know, you people that like to tell me that you'd sooner vote for a one-celled organism than vote for George W. Bush. How does it make you feel when your own news outlets uses that fascist as an example for why your party's equally fascist policies are a good idea? And how do you like it when they cite Dick Cheney, which they also do there? You know, Mr. Dark Lord of the Sith, who is responsible for everything that's wrong with this country. Your own news sources cite these people as examples for why their ideas, which are the same as Bush's and Cheney's ideas, supposedly work. I don't think I need to even get into how ridiculously bad things are with regards to unemployment right now. But suffice to say, when you take a narrow view of economics and you try to pass it off as gospel, you should be laughed off the stage. And unfortunately, the audience is full of ignorant neophytes, and as a result, this stuff gets applauded. If you doubt this, read the comments that are found on this page, and I'll link it in the description, and you'll see just how idiotic this stuff is. Anyway, I went extremely long on this, and I'm going to wrap this up now. For those of you that actually were able to sit through this whole thing, I thank you. And until next time, with prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.